Hello again. Thank you to the five of you for being here. We also have a lot of people for this discussion. As Cécile said, we're going to talk about nuclear's role in shipping, which is a super interesting topic given the needs for decarbonization. This topic is resurfacing in discussions about shipping's future. I'm glad to have with me to talk about it Émilie Espanet. You're the Secretary General of New Energies Coalition, the Energy Coalition for Transport and Logistics. Also with us, Jean-Étienne Quintin. You're a member of the Marine Navy Academy. Didier Daoulas, you're the head of Marine Energy and Logistics at BC, which is an insurance consultant. Arthur Darde, who's an entrepreneur in the world of energy and the founder of Aeronax, and Jean-Louis Falgoux, the head of the global nuclear entity at Bureau Veritas. Émilie Espanet, for you first. Shipping accounts for nearly 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Everything is urging to decarbonization. Why is the maritime sector taking a look at nuclear now? I only have 2 minutes to answer, right? Well, hello everyone. Thank you for inviting me and thank you for giving nuclear the floor. The coalition is a coalition of about 20 players who have got together to accelerate decarbonization. We work on all modes of transport, not just shipping, but also aviation and road, and with various partners, including Bureau Veritas and PSA, not the car maker, but the Singapore terminals. We've worked on a study that you can read on newenergiescoalition.com. I can bring the study here, but why have we been looking at nuclear for the last couple of years? Maritime shipping consumes about 300 million tons of fuel every year. That's the same percentage, about 3% of global energy. So when talking about shipping decarbonization, we must aim to decarbonize all industry, and energy needs are huge. 55,000, 60,000 vessels over 5,000 tons in the world operating. Now the order book, if you look at it by 2030, is for about 2,000 renewable production ships. Not yet any nuclear, but LNG or methanol. And if you look at the replacement rate, energy transition will happen in two phases. First, what can I do on existing ships that are still operating in 2050, 2040, 2050? And how can I prepare for the future, for future ship orders and new modes of propulsion? Now you can choose different molecules, talking about biofuels or e-fuels. You know that biofuel molecules are limited in quantity, so we're looking at other modes like sail-assisted propulsion. We're talking about ship redesign. We'll have windshields in front of containers to reduce consumption, and this is not either or in terms of these technologies. We need to combine them, and we're also using AI to optimize routes. But when talking about zero emission, the regulatory framework that was voted in April 2025 by the IMO with incentives, the reduction obligations for carbon footprint in shipping of -20 to -30% by 2030 compared to 2008, and -70 to -80% by 2040. -70, -80, I was talking about 300 million tons. Well, that means huge amounts of energy. So now the industry is looking at nuclear as a new additional mode of propulsion, which looks more and more serious with a lot of projects in the pipeline, and that we'll be glad to explain during this discussion. Quite ambitious goals, indeed. Arthur Darde, to exit fossil fuels. What are these solutions you're recommending? When you look at large ships, those that will consume the most, they need a lot of range for days and weeks of navigation for transoceanic ships, and they need a lot of power to push 300,000 tons at decent speeds of about 20 knots, and that restricts the amounts of fuels that you can use. You need dense fuels, so liquid fuels. They can be liquid by being fossil, diesel, oil, or liquid natural gas, or their synthetic versions, or biological versions, or nuclear. But beyond that, there's no other solution. And synthetic fuels that can be produced in a decarbonized way will also be interesting for other sectors like aviation that will consume about as much, and they don't have the nuclear option available. What we mean by these needs is that the choice is fairly limited, so it's obvious that in detail we need to look at technologies that have been pushing ships or submarines for 70 years. Yes, but all that requires ports that are accessible. And regarding port attractiveness, I'm looking at you, Jean-Louis Falgoux. Could you receive nuclear-equipped container ships in France? What are the infrastructure needs otherwise, if applicable? Well, first of all, thank you for receiving us. Bureau Veritas is a trusted third party in the world of insurance. And when talking about nuclear, we hear about it now, as you know. And nuclear, we've been talking about container ships or vessels with nuclear propulsion. But my message is that we need you. Our number one issue for all of us is decarbonizing energy. And that starts, as far as we are concerned for the topic today, that starts with electrifying harbors. In harbors, we need to be able to provide large sources of energy. And there's a real issue there. We've been working on that. There are a few projects that are now becoming mature around the world to install small power stations, talking about SMR, small modular reactors, small nuclear power stations that need to be as close as possible to consumers. And in harbors, there are huge energy needs. But these aren't projects for 2050, 2060. These are projects for 2030. The technology is here. In France, we have the technology for small-sized nuclear reactors. Around the world, of course, there are large players. We can build them in France. We've got the right regulatory framework in France and the world to build these facilities. There's an issue. We're working with insurers. There's an insurance issue because you can imagine that we'll build a nuclear power station, a small one, but that's still a nuclear facility near a site, which is usually Seveso classified, and we'll need to find the right insurance model, how to manage risk. Well, these are questions we'll ask next year, probably. Well, probably next year, but for 2030, we'll need solutions to insure these organizations. We're talking about harbors that will be able to deliver energy. That's the first thing. But your question was more about whether we are now able to receive these container ships with nuclear facilities on board. No. At present, there is no site in France. I'm talking about civilian sites. Of course, if you're going to military bases, it's a different matter. But there are no sites in France or abroad that can receive them. However, we can design. We've got the right experience to design and build these facilities, but you're talking about time scales of 2050, 2060. That might be beyond today's topic. Well, if I can add something, there's a regulatory aspect that is essential in Europe. We have an obligation to have shore power in terminals by 2030. That's a fairly big obligation in terms of energy needs for terminals, because energy needs in terminals will increase 4 to 6-fold compared to what they currently use. 4 to 6 times the current energy consumption volume. So there are real issues with access to renewable energy for terminals in France and worldwide. A word of information: if you take a container ship going from Asia to Europe, the share of terminals in energy consumption over this route is 8%. It's not negligible. Giving access to renewable energy, nuclear or decarbonized energy in a terminal is also a matter of decarbonizing shipping. Thank you for the clarification. Emily, still talking to you. I'll give you the floor to the others. But could you give us a current landscape of what's already available for civilian ships that are nuclear powered? Well, you'll have noticed that women are asked the difficult questions. Well, More seriously, in the world, there are about 160. Well, the gentlemen know as well as I do that there are about 160 nuclear-powered ships or vessels, mostly submarines, but also icebreakers, a lot of them in Russia and China. We also have aircraft carriers, rather for military use. In the past, there were prototypes for civilian nuclear vessels. An anecdote, I was talking about that earlier, the first nuclear-powered civilian vessel, the Lenin, a project in 1957, launched in 1959. 1957, that was 1 year after containers were invented. Their paths never crossed, but maybe one day they will, because they're in the same generation. And so these are projects. There were prototypes. There was the Savannah in the US. There was the Tuang in Germany. Those projects have been stopped, but there are more and more projects, as you've discussed, for floating platforms called floating nuclear power plants that are being deployed. And here there are over 80 projects in development now, so a lot of them. Regarding what's available now for nuclear, there are nuclear-powered vessels, but how can we adapt that to civilian uses, and how can we get ready for civilian uses? So mostly military vessels now, of course. Jean-Etienne Quintin, looking at you, what is the current legislative situation when it comes to nuclear-powered vessels? In the 60s, nuclear legal experts supported the development of terrestrial civilian energy generation, and that led to two main international conventions, the Paris and Vienna Conventions, amended several times. At the same time, there was the question of knowing whether we could adapt propulsion means to vessels. What about nuclear law, nuclear liability law for vessel operators? To use a decarbonized botanical metaphor, it's dormant, it's in dormancy. Why? Because there were legal texts that were drafted, others have come into force, but a comment on three major texts. The first one is the Brussels Convention 1962, governing operator responsibility for civilian nuclear-powered vessels. But for lack of vessels, for lack of economic business models that would be viable and profitable, it was never ratified. The text exists, and of course it would need to be cleaned up a bit. The second major text, and that's a coincidence in the calendar, but right now at the IMO there is the 110th Conference on Maritime Safety. On the agenda of this conference, taking place between the 18th and 27th of June, they are upgrading the thinking about Chapter 8 of the Convention on Safeguarding Lives at Sea, SOLAS, for nuclear vessels. This is the 1981 Nuclear Code, which is now fairly obsolete because it only refers to a number of types of propulsion, such as pressurized water reactors, and now it's quite distant from currently used technologies. And there's one last text. The paradox of the system is that France is ahead of its time, because the only positive law text is the law of 12 November 1965. In 23 articles, it quotes the main principles of the International Convention of 1962. There is a body of laws and legislations and convention that exist, but it's no longer fit for purpose for the current technology. So it's really upcoming legislation that needs to be upgraded. Jean-Louis Falgoux, Didier Daoulas, please, could you speak about the main obstacles and barriers that can be found on the adoption of nuclear in shipping, maybe social and political acceptance? Didier Daoulas. First of all, thank you for giving me the floor. First of all, a testimonial about the fact that, of course, it's possible to run vessels on nuclear power, because for 30 years I served in the submarine force, especially nuclear deterrent submarines. I was an atomic engineer by training, and so we had pressurized water reactors on board these submarines, and this is fully controlled technology. These are compact reactors that can be fully integrated in an attack submarine that needs to be 7 meters in diameter, which is not very big. So it is possible. But then there are barriers to the switch to civilian applications. There are technological and technical obstacles that Jean-Louis talked about. The technology is now well controlled. I worked, we've had 20 years of nuclear bashing, so it's nice that we can have these discussions now. And for 10 years now, because of decarbonization issues, nuclear is touted as one of the solutions. There is interest. We're investing, and there are entrepreneurs imagining to adapt nuclear technology to shore energy needs or for onboard nuclear propulsion. We can master these nuclear challenges. It should be embedded in in a civilian vessel. We can do that. We need to be able to ensure maintenance, because over nuclear life cycles, you need to be able to maintain these vessels. So you need specific infrastructure adapted to that. There are specificities. It's very technical, but there are some. Also, the ability to refuel the ship. Onboard reactor technologies mean that we would need every 10 to 15 years to partially or totally refuel the reactor. Then acceptance. That's the second obstacle. We are all working on that, but we are lucky now to have a lot of experience with a large nuclear fleet, 12 civilian reactors. We have 2 reactors on aircraft carriers and dozens of reactors on submarines. So in terms of risk management, we are in a fully trusted situation. We also need finance, which is another obstacle when I'm talking about finance, because we're talking about long-term investments. You won't consider installing nuclear reactors on board vessels in a reversible way for just a short time for prototypes. It wouldn't make sense, because it takes a lot of investment in terms of design and training and personnel certification. You need insurability with, I'm lumping that together with finance needs. It's important for us all. So we need to master that, and insurability is essential. Legal obstacles that were mentioned, we need to adapt legislation, and not just French legislation and regulation, but also IMO regulation and other bodies, other harbors where we would need to stop over. And also it's for the long term, of course, because a reactor has a long lifetime. At least for nuclear reactors, the lifetime of the boiler and the reactor is as long as that of the vessel, and then we need to handle decommissioning. It's about 50 years, yes. Simply, Jean-Louis Falgoux, I'll let you add to that. Yes, to add to that, in the maritime world, I don't know whether we can talk about a standard bearer, but rather a flag bearer. We really need an entity with strong political will to kickstart these projects. Why am I saying that? Because if you're looking at what's going on outside France or even Europe, you realize that right now, such projects for nuclear-powered vessels, barges with a small nuclear reactor on them, are making progress in Russia or in China. Jean-Christophe was talking about upgrading the guidelines or codes. He was talking about the meeting today. This week there's a meeting at the level of the IAEA. The Koreans and Chinese and Russians and Americans are saying we need to change legislation, but the French and Europeans are nowhere. Nobody's tackling that, whereas we have everything we need. It's unfortunate there's no political will in Europe. Well, we've got the skills in France, but there's a lack of European political will. Harbors only want that to happen, and so companies would probably be ready to work on that in order precisely to find a European solution. Who would you identify for that, to push this project forward? Your neighbor? Well, we'll need people with the right skills in terms of reactor management, nuclear reactor management. We've got people like that in France and Europe. There are enough European power generators in Europe with those skills. We've got CMA, CGM that's probably ready to take the lead. I think the ecosystem can be there to offer a solution, but right now it doesn't exist. I'll now give the floor to Arthur Dard to see what the risks would be for the development of the solution. For that to take off, indeed, you need a long-term vision because there are a lot of issues that are interconnected in terms of development. We need regulation. As long as you don't know the rules of the game, it's hard to develop a solution. But at the same time, regulations are built on concrete examples moving forward. So we need to have confidence in the long term. There are other risks in identifying business models. The business model for a ship owner, taking a ship owner, the owner of a container ship, their business model would be severely changed if they're using nuclear-powered vessels with a lot of upfront investment, and so a lower trade-off on routes because the investments was made upfront, whatever the distance or routes traveled. So we need to be part of the building of this new business model based on regulation. From that flows the right technological options. How often do you refuel with new, fresh nuclear fuel? How often can you admit interruptions for maintenance? All that requires a long-term visibility over motivation for setting carbon prices, setting a price on energy sovereignty. All that is necessary to make progress. These are so many things that can be risks or opportunities to progress. Risk, yes, Didier Daoulas, we need to train and certify crews. So that also takes a lot of time. Yes, the HR challenge is very big because, as we said, it's long-term. The entire HR supply chain needs to be organized between operators and engineers. And there are very specific functions such as chemists and people working on instrumenting the boiler. I was an atomic engineer. It takes 2 years to train an engineer and 1 year for operators, with a certification phase on platforms to validate their reactions in case of an incident or accident for all crew. And so the Nuclear Safety Authority imposes individual and collective certification to guarantee that all reactions will be perfectly adapted. So it takes a long time to train people. With ship owners, we would need to monitor their crew over the long term to make sure that they are certified. In the Navy, we had 1 chemist per ship. So for a container ship, you'd probably need 10 chemists. It takes 1.5 years to train them, monitor them, and qualify them. It will take a lot of investment in human terms and also HR terms. So probably it would be in series. If you only have 1 nuclear-powered vessel, the investment that will be necessary is for technology in the reactor, but also in HR. That means that you'll only mobilize some of your staff on this boat, so you'll need several nuclear-powered boats. Well, of course, that needs to be promoted. Emily Espanet, let's talk about technology. What kind of ship could be the first to be equipped? Great question. It's about size. SMRs, as we were explained, small modular reactors, have a power of 30 to 100 megawatts if you look at the energy needs on various ships. I'm sorry, technical problem with my microphone. It all depends on the distance traveled. You've got long haul, short haul, but right now studies show that there are two types of vessels that are particularly well suited. Container ships that need 40 to 50 megawatts and cruising ships. Cruising ships transporting public passengers with container ships that you need 14 to 20 crew members. So the first prototypes that were identified are container ships that were identified, and there are initial projects, first design concepts that have been filed for from Russia or China. That's now a reality. It's making progress. The technology would mature in 2035, 2036 for third generation SMRs, and we're talking about 2040 for fourth generation SMRs. That's in 10 years. That gives us time to create the regulatory framework, talking about tests in Europe. For a carbon tax, it took us 5 years in Europe. So it's for the long haul, but that's difficult for investment, significant investments, but also there's the reality, the countdown. If we want to be ready by 2035, what do I need to do? And another thing that's important that you talked about now, if we project costs about the economic viability of nuclear, the equation means that it's balanced, but there are a lot of uncertainties now, especially the cost of insurance. So I'd like to ask you to start working on that, because if that share is not made clearer in the future, of course, investments will take a lot longer, but that's a message to the audience. I think they've heard you. They are anticipating that. One last question about routes that are expected to be served. I don't have a crystal ball, but we're always looking at the study that was published in April 2025 that is very recent, published on our website with Deloitte. Do look at it, it's very interesting. The first routes that emerge are intra-China, between harbors on short distances, and also trans-Pacific, China to US. Shanghai and the US and Los Angeles are talking about green corridors. They are talking about these technologies. We're also beginning to look at Northern Europe, but also intra-Asia, from China to Singapore. Singapore is really raising awareness amongst its population to be able to welcome the first vessels. And there are harbors that have taken the lead. Regulators are working with ports, but a container ship is on a maritime route. It's not pendular. They will make 5, 6, 7, 8 stops in different ports. And so if you're talking about China to the US, it's pendular shipping between two harbors. Of course, this use will make things more complex when it comes to the use case for nuclear. The business model is fairly flexible. You take a container ship that's serving Asia to Europe, you can put it Asia to the US overnight. There's no regulatory constraints, but if constraints change overnight, that will be a constraint on operations for container ships, without adding the issue of energy being available in all ports. Arthur Dard. There's one country in the world that has 2 commercial harbors with one ocean in between, and for which the route won't cross any other countries. That country is France. Between the West Indies and the mainland, you could imagine a route very often with refrigerated containers. They need more speed, more energy needs, and so there's no negotiation needed. Of course, there's a lot of traffic between Los Angeles and Shanghai, but nuclear discussions between China and the US could take a while, but for us, it would not be a problem. There's a considerable number of ships that would warrant such a thinking of a number of actors in the French ecosystem, but with a slight caveat here. Well, it's you're fuller. Think about economic profitability. You're fuller between China and the US. It's mostly France to the West Indies that ships are full. The other way, the ships are not so full, not so filled. So it's all about the economic viability that needs to be looked at.
And then if you have nuclear-powered ships, these maritime corridors should be dedicated to this kind of ships, because that's what I was trying to say in terms of routes. What it is that initially we were thinking of having dedicated paths port to port, but the thing is, normally these container ships go from port to port. You don't go just one line. Between Shanghai and Los Angeles, you have the beginning of that, but then you have well, if you do smaller trips from on the coast, then it's different power that you need. But technology is developing, and we might be able to adjust to that. What about ship owners upstream going for nuclear power for merchant shipping? What would be the consequences? Again, you have to look at things over the long run, and it's not just upstream; it's upstream and downstream. Of course, there's the economic criterion, because it's got to be profitable, cost efficient, net zero emissions. This means that you could have other forms of fuels involving ammonium and ethanol, I don't know. But right now, ship owners use oil-based fuels, and so everybody was doing the same. And here you'd have a new paradigm, because there you'll have some ship owners going for different types of power. I mean, of course, if you go for nuclear, you know your costs well over the long run. But then you have these costs, and what about the cargo? Because, of course, you need to... will you find the customers prepared to ship their goods through these nuclear-powered vessels? Because the cost will be higher. I mean, you're looking at if cargo... well, if the cost of shipping will multiply threefold, well, then, of course, the ship owner who's decided to go nuclear will see a return on the investment. But if that's not the case, if there's a drop in demand, or if not as good as you'd think, or if the competition can offer better prices, then it might not be profitable after all. So when you're dealing with the military, it's all public budgets, and so the issue isn't there. But here, it's a private market, and the market on which the ship owner finds himself will be competition, and the cargo prices might be attractive if the prices are high enough, but sometimes the costs are too high, and too high compared to the revenue. And then you can see whether ship owners will be the ones who will be running their ships on nuclear energy. I mean, maybe that responsibility will be passed on to a company that specializes this. Because here again, you're looking at the long run. When it comes to decommissioning a nuclear-powered boat, there are all sorts of issues that are not, well, there will always be technical questions. I'll turn to you now, Jean-Louis Falgoux, as a certification office. Can we consider in the short run, a certification for this kind of ship, a nuclear-powered ship? Well, in the short run, for something that is supposed to be a long-term project, no, of course. I mean, when we do have nuclear boats up and running, yes, of course, certification will be ready for that. But now it's still experimental. As it is, we're working on the regulation. We, of course, a stakeholder because we are an international certification body, and there is competition from the Chinese, from the Koreans, from the Americans, but everybody wants the regulation to be there so that they know what the rules are. And that will apply. We will also have IAEA regulation. I mean, there are all sorts of things being put into place. But once, I mean, we'll be ready when that day comes. But in the meantime, we're still in the learning process. And in the meantime, you'll need to have some kind of insurance systems set up, not just the insurance schemes, but the routes. I mean, for a nuclear boat, you need to have special bodies. There will be a security organization that will be supervising the security issues. There will be, on top of safety, of course, and it's a huge concept. Now, in the short run, we won't be ready because it will take time. But in the long run, yes, I'm sure we'll have everything in order. Jean-Louis, if you were to quote the key condition for the nuclear power to find its place in shipping, well, there would be, in fact, three conditions, three preconditions. First, there has to be some political will. There's lots of entry barriers right now, and the technological barrier is not the most challenging, because we know how to set up a small modular reactor on the ship, and we have SMRs that are improving all the time. So what's really needed is the political will to let it happen. The second thing is trust, and that means we have to be able to know the risks, to control the risks, to share the risks, and of course this risk is well controlled, but we're talking about a high intensity risk. So there's got to be a sharing of that risk amongst the various players. And then, of course, there are safety issues. SMRs are self-secured. In other words, in any incident, the SMR can put itself in a secure state. So that should make players more confident. And then, over the long run, you'll need scaling up of investment. I mean, there's been significant capital expenditure. A ship owner should be able to have a sizable fleet to get a return on their investment. But that also requires land-based infrastructure and significant human resources. Just a case in point, with the new nuclear industry in France, we're looking at 10,000 people have got to be recruited every year. 10,000 people with the right skills. Well, that's a potential market right there. We have no time to go for further questions, but next year we will see what the insurance consequences will be. But it's good to see that there's as much interest as there are challenges in that field of nuclear power for shipping. And now, feel free to go back. And now, the moment you've been waiting for is the coffee break. We'll be back in half an hour.